Dawn broke slowly over the lake, the sky bleeding from black to deep purple to a bruised gray that promised rain. Jason stood at the window of his room, the watch heavy in his palm, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He hadn't slept. Hadn't even tried after those long hours of pacing and thinking in circles that led nowhere. Behind him, his bag sat on the bed still unpacked. A statement in itself. He'd made his decisions somewhere around 5 a.m. when the exhaustion had burned through his anger and left only a strange, cold clarity. It wasn't the decision he'd expected to make. It wasn't the one his mother would want, or the one Claire and Margaret were waiting for downstairs. It was the only one that made sense. Jason slipped the watch onto his wrist muscle memory from years of wearing it and opened his door. The hallway stretched before him, quiet and still. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, softer than it had been that first day, as if even the sun was tired of this place. He found them in the kitchen. Margaret stood at the counter, her back straight, pouring coffee with the precision of someone performing a ritual. She was already dressed, her hair pulled back, every inch the composed woman who delivered ultimatums by firelight. Claire sat at the small table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. When she looked up and saw Jason, something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe. Or just resignation. "You're up early," Margaret said without turning around. She poured a third cup and set it on the counter, an offering or an assumption. "Coffee?" Jason ignored the cup. He stayed in the doorway, aware of how the space between them felt wider now, unbridgeable. "I want to hear it from you, the whole truth, not threats, not manipulation, just the truth about my father." Margaret turned slowly, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she simply studied him, as if weighing what he could handle. Then she nodded once and gestured to the table. "Sit. I'll stand." Claire's laugh was brittle, humorless. "Still fighting for control. You're like him in that way, at least." "I'm nothing like him," Jason said, the words sharp enough to cut. "Because I'm still here, I didn't run." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Margaret picked up her coffee, cradling it between her hands like it might warm something inside her that had gone cold years ago. "Your father's name was Daniel Reed," she began, her voice stripped of emotion, clinical. "Our brother, the youngest of the three of us. He was charming, intelligent, reckless, the kind of person who could talk his way into anything or out of anything. Our parents adored him. They trusted him completely." She paused, her eyes distant, looking at something Jason couldn't see. "When our parents died. Car accident. Actually, not that it matters how they left everything in a trust. $2 million, divided equally among the three of us. But the trust was complicated. It required unanimous agreement to access the funds. Our parents wanted to make sure we worked together, stayed together as a family. They thought it would bind us." Claire laughed again, that same broken sound. "Instead, it gave Daniel all the power he needed. Because he had access to the paperwork. He was the executor, and he was the one who discovered the loophole." "The safety deposit box," Jason said quietly. Margaret nodded. "He convinced us to consolidate everything there. Said it was safer, smarter, easier to manage. We believed him. Why wouldn't we? He was our brother." The bitterness in her voice was corrosive, eating through her composure. "2 keys. He said we'd each hold one, that it would require both of us present to access the funds. A safeguard." "But he lied," Jason said. "He lied," Margaret confirmed. "He had copies made. And one night, 20 years ago, he emptied the account and disappeared. By the time we realized what had happened, he was gone. Your mother was gone, and so was every penny of our inheritance." Jason's chest tightened. His hand went instinctively to the watch on his wrist. "My mother knew. She had to have known," Claire said softly. "Maybe not before. Maybe he convinced her it was legitimate, that he was protecting the money from us somehow. Daniel was good at making people believe his version of things. But after, when he disappeared, she knew then, and she chose to stay silent." The words landed like stones in deep water, sinking slowly. Jason thought of his mother's face when she'd given him the watch. The tears in her eyes. The way she'd said, "This was your father's. He wanted you to have it." Had she known what was inside? Had she been passing him a burden or trying to give him a choice she'd never had? Why not go to the police, Jason asked. If he stole from you, if you had proof, because proving it would have destroyed all of us, Margaret interrupted. The trust was legal, but Daniel's access to it was murky. We'd have to admit our own negligence, our own blindness. We'd have to face investigations, audits, questions about why we didn't notice sooner. And your mother, she would have been caught in the middle, maybe charged as an accessory, maybe not, but her life would have been ruined either way. So you did nothing, Jason said, and he couldn't keep the accusation out of his voice. We did everything, Claire snapped, her exhaustion finally cracking into anger. We hired private investigators. We followed every lead, every rumor. We spent years trying to find him, trying to get back what was ours. But your father was smart. He planned it perfectly. He disappeared completely. And then, eventually, we heard he was dead. The car accident, Jason whispered. Margaret shook her head. We never believed it. No body, no funeral, just a death certificate filed in a county where he had no ties, no history. It was too convenient, too clean. We always suspected he faked it, that somewhere he was living under a new name with our money, laughing at how easily he'd gotten away with it. But we couldn't prove anything, Claire added. Not without the keys, not without access to that safety deposit box. So we waited. We watched your mother, hoping she'd slip up, give us some clue, but she never did. She protected his secret. She protected him, even after he'd abandoned her. Jason's mind reeled. His entire childhood, his mother had carried this weight. Every time she'd worked late, every time she'd worried about bills, every time she'd told him they had enough when he knew they didn't. She'd been living with the knowledge of $2 million hidden away, untouchable. And then you found me, Jason said. And then we found you, Margaret confirmed. It took us years. Your mother moved, changed her name legally after the supposed death, but digital footprints are hard to erase completely. 3 months ago, we finally tracked you down, and when we saw you were still wearing the watch, you knew, Jason finished. Claire's eyes filled with tears, though her voice stayed steady. We knew that was our only chance. The safety deposit box requires both keys. Daniel had one hidden in that watch. The other we have it. We've always had it. We've always had it. But we needed you to give us yours willingly. Breaking into it, forcing it open, that would have triggered alarms, investigations. We needed cooperation. So you created this. Jason's gesture encompassed the house, the week, everything that had happened. The phone call, the invitation, the confessions by the lake, making me think. He couldn't finish. The humiliation still burned too hot. We did what we had to do, Margaret said, and there was no apology in her voice. We're not proud of the methods, but we're not ashamed either. Your father stole our future, Jason. He took the security our parents died to give us. We're 62 and 58 years old, and we're still working because we can't afford not to. We can't retire. We can't travel. We can't travel. We can't help our own children with college because there's nothing to give. Every day we watch our lives get smaller while somewhere that money sits in a box, doing nothing. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft ticking of Jason's watch. He looked at them, these two women who'd orchestrated an elaborate deception, who'd manipulated him so thoroughly he questioned his own sanity. And beneath his anger, beneath the hurt, he saw something else. He saw two people who'd been betrayed by someone they loved, who'd spent 20 years in a kind of purgatory, caught between justice and family, between what was stolen and what could be proven. If I give you the watch, Jason said slowly, what happens to my mother? Margaret's expression softened just slightly. Nothing. This stays between us. We access the box, we take what's ours, and we disappear from your lives. Your mother never needs to know we found you. She can keep whatever peace she's built. And my father, if he's alive? We don't care about revenge, Claire said quietly. We just want our money back. If Daniel is alive somewhere, he can keep his new life. We won't come after him. We just want what was stolen returned. Jason turned the watch on his wrist, feeling its weight in a way he never had before. This small piece of metal and glass had been sitting against his skin for 10 years, ticking away seconds of his life, carrying a secret that had shaped everything without him knowing it. He thought about his father, the ghost he'd mourned, the hero he'd imagined, the thief he'd turned out to be. He thought about his mother, working herself to exhaustion to provide for him, carrying the weight of her husband's crime in silence. He thought about Claire and Margaret, two women whose lives had been derailed by betrayal, who'd spent 20 years trying to recover what was taken from them. And he thought about himself, about the choice in front of him, about what kind of person he wanted to be when this was over. "I'll give you the watch," Jason said finally. Relief washed over Claire's face so completely it was almost painful to witness. Margaret's shoulders lowered just slightly, tension bleeding out of her rigid posture. "But not yet," Jason continued, and they both froze. "I need to understand something first. I need to know if this watch actually contains what you think it does. I need to see the proof, because right now all I have is your word. And forgive me if I don't find that particularly trustworthy anymore." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded slowly. "That's fair." She disappeared into the living room and returned with a small leather bag. From inside, she produced a rolled envelope yellowed with age. She spread the contents across the kitchen table: documents, photographs, bank statements from 20 years ago, showing transfers and deposits that told a story of theft executed with careful precision. And then the last piece, an old photograph of Daniel Reed, Jason's father, wearing the exact watch that now sat on Jason's wrist. Jason picked up the photo with trembling fingers. The man in the picture was young, maybe 30, with Jason's eyes and his smile. He wore jeans and a casual shirt, his arm around a woman Jason didn't recognize. But the watch on his wrist was unmistakable, the same blue face, the same thick silver band. "This was taken 6 months before he disappeared," Margaret said softly. "We found it in a box of his things your mother left behind when she moved. It's the only photo we have of him with the watch." Jason set down the photograph and took a deep breath. His hands moved to the watch, unfastening the clasp. It came off his wrist easily after so many years of wearing it, leaving a pale stripe of skin where it had sat. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly, studying every detail. The craftsmanship was excellent, seamless, no obvious hiding places. If there was a key inside, it was integrated so perfectly that even close examination revealed nothing. "How do we open it?" he asked. Claire produced a small toolkit from the leather bag. "The key is in the winding mechanism. You have to disassemble the crown." Jason set the watch down on the table and stepped back. "You do it. I don't want to be responsible if something breaks." Margaret's hands were steady as she picked up the tiny tools and began working on the watch. The crown resisted at first, then began to unscrew in a way that wasn't normal, revealing threading that went deeper than it should have. Her movements were careful, practiced. She'd clearly researched this, prepared for this moment. After several tense minutes, something clicked. The crown came free, and with it a small piece of metal no bigger than Jason's thumbnail. Flat, with notches along one edge and a number stamped into the surface, 4782. A safety deposit box key. Jason stared at it, this tiny thing that had been so close to him for so long, hidden in plain sight. This key that represented his father's crime, his mother's secret, and Claire and Margaret's stolen future. "There it is," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked. 20 years. 20 goddamn years. Margaret's hand shook as she set down the tools. For the first time since Jason had arrived, she looked her age exhausted, worn down by decades of waiting and wanting, and watching opportunity slip through her fingers. Jason reached out and took the key from her palm before she could pull it away. Both women tensed. "I have conditions," Jason said quietly. "You don't have a right to conditions," Margaret started, but Claire put a hand on her arm, silencing her. "What conditions?" Claire asked, her voice hoarse. Jason closed his fist around the key. "I come with you. To the bank. To open the box. I see what's inside with my own eyes. I need to know if what you've told me is true, if this is really what you say it is, or if there's something else going on that you haven't mentioned." Fine, Margaret said immediately. We can do that. And, Jason continued, you leave my mother alone. Completely. Forever. Whatever she knew or didn't know, whatever part she played, that's between her and me. You don't contact her, you don't threaten her. You take your money and you disappear from our lives like you promised. Agreed, Claire said, before Margaret could respond. Jason looked between them. These two women who'd lied to him so convincingly, who'd made him feel things he was still ashamed to acknowledge. Could he trust them to keep their word? Probably not. But he had the key now, and that gave him leverage he hadn't had before. When? He asked. The bank opens at 9, Margaret said, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7. We should leave by 8 to make it in time. Jason nodded. He pocketed the key and headed toward the stairs. Where are you going? Claire called after him. To shower and change. Unless you object, we'll be ready when you are, Margaret said. Jason paused at the base of the stairs and looked back at them. Two women sitting in the morning light, both of them looking suddenly small and old and tired. Women who'd committed emotional fraud anyway, but who'd also been victims themselves. Women who'd done terrible things for understandable reasons. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm sorry my father did this to you. I'm sorry you lost 20 years of your lives to this. Claire's sob was sudden and raw. Margaret just nodded once, her jaw tight. Jason climbed the stairs to his room and closed the door. He showered quickly, the hot water doing nothing to ease the tension in his muscles. He dressed in clean clothes, packed his bag with methodical care, and tried not to think about what would come after today. Would he call his mother? Confront her with what he'd learned? Or would he carry this secret the way she had, protecting her from the consequences of choices made long before he was old enough to have a say? He didn't have answers yet. Maybe he never would. At 8 o'clock exactly, Jason descended the stairs with his bag. Claire and Margaret were waiting by the door, both of them composed now, professional. They could have been any three people setting out for an ordinary day instead of what this really was, the culmination of 2 decades of searching and scheming. The drive to the bank took 90 minutes, most of it in silence. Jason sat in the back seat, watching the landscape change from pine forests to small towns to the outskirts of a mid-sized city he didn't recognize. Claire drove with white-knuckled precision. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed forward. No one spoke until they pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank, an imposing brick building that looked like it had been there for a century. Ready? Margaret asked, turning to look at Jason. He nodded, though ready felt like the wrong word. He'd never be ready for this. But he was here, and the key was in his pocket, and the only way out was through. Inside, the bank was quiet and formal, all dark wood and hushed voices. Margaret approached the desk and spoke in low tones to a banker in a pressed suit. He nodded, checked their identification, and led them to a private room lined with safety deposit boxes of various sizes. Box 4782 was near the bottom, larger than Jason had expected. The banker inserted one key, the one the bank held, and waited. Margaret produced the second key from her purse, the twin to the one Jason had been carrying unknowingly all these years. She handed it to Jason. You should do it, she said quietly. It's your inheritance too. In a way. Jason's hand shook as he took the key and inserted it into the second lock. He turned it at the same time the banker turned his, and something inside the mechanism clicked. The box slid free. The banker set it on the table and left them alone, closing the door behind him with a soft click. For a long moment, none of them moved. They just stared at the metal box, this ordinary container that had held so much power over their lives. Finally, Margaret lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of bonds, certificates of deposit, financial documents in protective sleeves, and beneath all of it, a letter and a sealed envelope addressed to no one. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the papers, checking numbers, verifying totals. Claire leaned over her shoulder, both of them moving with the focused intensity of people confirming a dream was real. Jason reached for the letter. Wait, Margaret said sharply, but she didn't stop him. The envelope wasn't sealed properly, just tucked closed, as if someone had meant to seal it but never got around to it. Jason opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting that slanted heavily to the right. If you're reading this, then I'm either dead or you finally found what I took. Either way, I suppose I owe you an explanation, though I doubt it will help. Margaret, Claire, I know what I did was unforgivable. I convinced myself I had good reasons. I told myself you didn't need the money as badly as I did, that I'd pay it back somehow, that I was borrowing rather than stealing. I was lying. To you, to myself, to everyone. The truth is simpler and uglier. I was a coward. I was drowning in debts you didn't know about, had made promises I couldn't keep. I saw a way out and I took it, and I told myself that made me clever rather than cruel. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that every day since I took that money, I've lived with the weight of what I did to you, to our family, to the trust our parents had in me. If there's any justice, you'll find this and reclaim what's yours. And if there's any mercy, you'll understand that I was weak, not evil, that I destroyed myself more thoroughly than I ever destroyed you. To my son, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. I'm sorry I left you with questions, an absence, and a lie about how I died. You deserved better. You deserve the truth. The money in this box belongs to Margaret and Claire. It always has. But the watch that was mine and now it's yours, not because you earned it or deserve it, but because it's all I have to give you. A broken man's broken gift. I hope you become everything I couldn't be. I hope you find the courage I lacked. I'm sorry. Daniel. The letter trembled in Jason's hands. He read it twice, then a third time, trying to find some meaning beyond the words themselves. An apology, yes, an admission of guilt, but also something else, a father, trying to reach across time and death, real or faked, to touch a son he'd abandoned. Claire was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face. Margaret stared at the financial documents, her jaw working like she was trying to find words and couldn't. Is it all there? Jason asked quietly. Margaret nodded. Yes, all of it, plus interest. The bonds matured. He kept it in instruments that would grow. She laughed, a harsh sound. Even in theft, he was trying to be responsible. Jason refolded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Then it's yours. Take it. I won't fight you for it. I never wanted his money anyway. Jason, Claire started, but he shook his head. I mean it. This was never mine. It was stolen from you, and you should have it back. My father made his choices. I don't have to defend them or profit from them. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. Thank you. They gathered the documents carefully, transferring them to a briefcase Margaret had brought. The process took time: verification, signatures, arrangements to transfer everything to their names. Jason sat quietly through it all, feeling strangely empty, like something had been lifted from him that he hadn't known he was carrying. When it was done, they walked out of the bank together into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright, too ordinary for what had just happened. What will you do now? Claire asked him as they reached the parking lot. Jason shrugged. Go home. Figure out what to say to my mother. Try to understand who my father really was. And the watch? Margaret asked. Jason looked down at his bare wrist, at the pale stripe where the watch had sat for 10 years. It's in pieces on your kitchen table. I don't think I want it back. They stood in uncomfortable silence, 3 people bound together by a crime committed 2 decades ago, by manipulation and revelation and choices that couldn't be unmade. We'll transfer $500,000 to an account in your name, Margaret said suddenly. Your share. Your father's share, technically, but it should be yours. I don't want it, Jason said immediately. Take it anyway, Claire insisted. Not as a gift, as closure, as acknowledgement that you were hurt in this too. That you lost something when Daniel made his choices. Jason started to refuse again, then stopped. Maybe they were right. Maybe he had lost something, a father he'd never really known, a truth he'd been denied. Maybe accepting some portion of the inheritance was a way of acknowledging that loss without endorsing the theft. Okay, he said finally, but I'm giving it to my mother. She's the one who actually suffered from his disappearance. She deserves to finally have some security. Margaret smiled faintly. That's probably what your father would have wanted, if he'd been capable of wanting the right things. They drove Jason back to the lake house so he could collect his car. The house looked different in the afternoon light, smaller, less ominous. Just a building beside a lake, nothing more. Jason loaded his bag into his trunk and stood for a moment looking at the place where he'd spent the strangest week of his life, where he'd been manipulated and deceived, but also where he'd learned truths he never would have sought on his own. Claire and Margaret stood on the porch, watching him. They looked relieved and exhausted, like they'd finally set down a burden they'd been carrying for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "I suppose this is goodbye," Jason said. "I suppose it is," Margaret agreed. "For what it's worth," Claire said softly, "I meant what I said that last night." Some of it felt real. "You're better than your father. I hope you know that." Jason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He got in his car and started the engine, and as he drove away, he watched them grow smaller in his rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by trees and distance. The drive back to Seattle passed in a blur. Jason's mind raced through everything he'd learned, everything he'd lost, everything that had changed. Somewhere along the highway, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "How's the visit going?" He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Interesting. We need to talk when I get home." Her response came quickly, "Is everything okay?" Eventually, Jason typed, "I think eventually everything will be okay." And as the miles passed and Seattle grew closer, he realized he meant it. The truth was painful. The betrayals were real, but he'd survived them. He'd made choices he could live with. He'd seen the worst of his family's history and hadn't been destroyed by it. In his pocket, his father's letter sat folded small. A broken man's broken gift. But also, maybe, a final lesson that weakness and mistakes didn't define you unless you let them. That you could acknowledge the wrong you'd done and still hope for something better. Jason pulled into his apartment complex as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering himself, preparing for the conversation he'd have to have with his mother. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this would be easy. But for the first time in a week, Jason felt like himself again. Not a nephew being manipulated, not a son caught in someone else's crime, but just himself, flawed and uncertain, but honest. He got out of the car, grabbed his bag, and headed inside to face whatever came next. The lake and its secrets were behind him now, and ahead was the rest of his life, built on truth instead of lies, on choices instead of obligations. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when he'd answered that phone call from two aunts he barely knew. But maybe, just maybe, it was the ending he needed.